3 seconds ago, a pack of constructs had cornered him. He pressed his back against the wall, only to find it wasn't a wall at all. It was that door, the one that hadn't opened in 1,000 years. And the only person in all of Arkandale who managed to open it turned out to be a 3-time exam failure, a loser with no talent and no money. Dan So lies face down in the dust on the dungeon floor and doesn't understand why he's still breathing. He ran without looking where he was going. The squad was left somewhere behind him. He ran into a dead-end corridor and slammed his back against the cold metal. This door was the talk of every tavern in Arkandale. Hundreds of adventurers had approached it and felt an icy dread. The strongest turned back halfway. The bravest retreated, their faces ashen. But Dan simply fell against it because there was nowhere to run. And he felt nothing. No terror, no pressure, just cold metal beneath his shoulder blades and a strange thought. His fingers glide over the surface and pause. Beneath his fingertips, he feels a seam, uneven, rough. Someone had riveted it in a hurry. Someone had been in a rush to finish and hadn't smoothed the edge, 1,000 years ago. Dan doesn't know where that thought came from. He doesn't know why his fingers suddenly move on their own. He isn't looking for the handle. He isn't pushing the door. He listens to the metal and turns it not the way everyone before him pulled it, but the way the mechanism asks. The door clicks, quietly, almost gratefully, and Dan falls inside. The impact against the stone floor knocks the wind out of his lungs. He rolls onto his back and opens his eyes wide. Above him is a dome, high, covered in lines that glow faintly blue, a hall the size of a city square. Along the walls, rows of dark mechanisms, guardian constructs, dozens, maybe hundreds, all dead. In the center stands a structure of intertwined gears and pipes, huge, complex, and broken. Even from here, Dan can see the bent shafts and cracked teeth. He stands up. Dust swirls in the dim light. No one has been in here for a very long time, maybe never. And then his head explodes, not with pain, with memory. He remembers the smell of rosin, the vise on the workbench, how he held a gear the size of a pinky fingernail with tweezers and inserted it into a pocket watch, the workshop, the museum, shelves with tools, a magnifying glass on his forehead, the old woman who brought in her late husband's watch. He promised to fix it by Friday. And then the fire. The wiring caught fire at night. He grabbed a box of other people's heirlooms and carried it outside because people had entrusted their belongings to him. And then he went back for his tools and didn't make it out in time. Smoke, heat, darkness. And here he is, 3 years in the body of a guy named Dan So, a small-town guy with no money and no talent. He failed the adventurer's exam 3 times, too weak, too slow, useless in battle. Kyra Vellen's squad took him in out of pity. The swordswoman with a sharp tongue and an even sharper blade had claimed they needed a porter. Everyone knew it was a lie. Kyra just couldn't watch a man die of starvation at the guild gates. For 3 years, Dan carried backpacks, gathered firewood, stood in the back while the squad fought, and didn't remember who he used to be. But now he remembers everything, every tool, every technique, every texture of metal and wood. 24 years in one world and 3 in another. An antique restorer and an eternal loser have merged into one person. And this person stands in the middle of a hall that hasn't seen a living soul in 1,000 years. Blue lines on the ceiling are flickering. The floor shudders. Something is waking up. Dan turns around. Behind him, the door has closed silently, and before him, a glow rises from beneath the dust. The great mechanism. The gears are still, but light is coming from its base. Blue, warm, alive. Dan steps forward. One more step. His legs carry him on their own. His hands reach for the mechanism before his mind decides what to do. His fingers touch the metal, and the world falls silent. He feels everything. Every tooth, every shaft, every bearing. He feels where the metal is worn out, where it is cracked with age, where it has rusted. He feels how the gears want to move, where they're eager to turn, what rhythm was originally built into them. It's like reading a book, only one written not with letters but with shapes, with curves, with alloys, with the design of the one who created it all. A voice in his head, not words, a sensation, as if the metal itself is speaking to him. You understand. The light flares brighter. A wave races across the walls and the lines light up all at once. The ceiling glows like the sky at dawn, and Dan realizes that the hall has accepted him. Not the strongest, not the bravest, the one who touched and did not break, the one who listened and did not strike, the one who, in another life, repaired other people's watches and died carrying other people's relics out of the fire. Warmth rises in his chest, not heat, not fire. Warmth like from a mother's hands, like from the first instrument that fit into his palm as if it were his own. The master's resonance. He doesn't know its name, but he knows that now he can do what no one else in this world can, to sense things, to understand them, to give them back what they have lost. The rumbling subsides, the light evens out. Dan stands in silence, alone, in the middle of a dead hall full of dead mechanisms, and for the first time in 3 years, he feels that his hands know what to do. A distant rumble, the sound of battle upstairs, the squad. Kira and the others are still fighting the constructs. They don't know where he's gone. Dan turns toward the door. It won't budge. He places his palm on the lock. He catches the jammed pin. He turns it. The door opens. He runs back down the corridor, toward the sounds of steel and screams, toward the people who have been carrying him on their backs out of pity for 3 years. He runs and feels a puck, as if every stone in the walls is waiting for his touch, as if the entire dungeon knows he'll return. The corridor led him to a fork. Dan turned toward the sound, the clang of metal, the crack of stone, Kira's voice. She was shouting something about the left flank. He burst out of the passageway and saw the fight. 3 guardian constructs, 2 meters tall, bodies of darkened bronze, red dots for eyes. They moved in jerks, spasmodic, wrong. One of them kicked the wall over and over, as if it didn't understand that it was stone before it, not an enemy. The second spun in place. The third's left arm hung by a single hinge and dragged across the floor. They were broken, all 3 of them. Not evil, not hunting, just broken mechanisms that couldn't stop. Kira stood in front, sword in her right hand, shield in her left, sweat on her face. She had been holding the defense for a long time. Behind her, Sora Lim was drawing her bow. The arrow flew and struck the construct in the shoulder joint. Sparks. The construct twitched but didn't fall. Yuna Han stood by the far wall. She was bandaging Kira's left forearm on the fly. The bandage was already red. Kira noticed Dan. Her eyes widened. She shouted for him to get out of there, to run back, to hide, as always. Dan didn't run. He looked at the constructs, and he didn't see enemies. He saw machines that had been running unattended for 1,000 years, without repairs, without a human who would understand that they had no malicious intent, just a jammed drive. A construct with a dragging arm turned toward him. Red dots flashed. Dan felt it. Not fear, resonance. As if the mechanism inside that bronze carcass were speaking to him. A hinge, the third one from the top. The retaining ring had popped off. That's why the arm is dangling. That's why the whole body is lopsided. That's why it's attacking. Because the signals in its body are going haywire and it can't stop. Dan raised his hand. Kira shouted again. Dan didn't listen. He stepped toward the construct. Sora lowered her bow. Yuna froze with the bandage in her hands. The construct swung its good arm. The bronze fist came down. Kira lunged forward. She couldn't get there in time. Dan stepped aside. The fist struck the floor. The stone cracked. Dan placed both palms on the construct's shoulder joint. It jerked, froze. The red dots flickered, turned orange. Dan closed his eyes. His fingers found the ring. It sat crooked. The metal around it was worn. 1,000 years of friction. He couldn't fix it with his bare hands, not here, not now. But he could do something else. He could show the construct where it hurt. A resonance passed through his palms into the mechanism. Not strength, not magic, just understanding. As if he were telling the machine, I know what's wrong with you. I know you don't want to strike. I know you just can't stop. The construct froze completely. The red dots turned yellow, then green. The arm that had been flailing through the air dropped. The bronze knees bent. The construct sat down on the floor. Heavily, slowly, like an old man whose back had finally given out. Silence. The other two constructs stopped too. The one that had been hitting the wall stopped. The one that had been spinning froze. They stood there and looked at Dan with green dots, as if they were waiting. Kira approached him, sword lowered, face pale. She asked what he had just done. Dan looked at his hands. They were trembling. He replied that he didn't know. But that was a lie. He knew. He just couldn't explain it. Sora approached quietly. She wasn't looking at the constructs. She was looking at Dan. Her eyes were attentive and calm. She didn't say anything. Yuna ran up to him and grabbed his shoulders. She examined his face, his hands.
Checked his pupils. Said he was as pale as chalk and that he needed to sit down.
Dan sat right on the floor next to the construct. The bronze body was warm. The mechanisms inside hummed quietly and evenly, as if, instead of pain, peace had finally come to him. Kira sheathed her sword sheath. She looked at the constructs. She looked at Dan. She said they were leaving. Right now. Before these things woke up again. Dan stood up. They headed for the exit. The three constructs remained seated, motionless, silent, with green dots for eyes. Dan looked back once. It seemed to him that the construct with the injured arm had tilted its head, just a little, as if saying goodbye. They emerged from the dungeon by evening. The sun was setting behind the city walls. The air smelled of grass and smoke from the forges. Kira walked ahead. She didn't turn around, but Dan could see that she was gripping the hilt of her sword so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her father's sword, an old blade with a crack running the entire length of the blade. The city's blacksmith said the metal was worn out. They said it would be easier to forge a new one. Kira didn't want a new one. She wanted this one. They reached the tavern. Yuna made everyone eat. Sora went to a corner and silently peeled an onion. Kira sat there, twirling the sword hilt in her hands. Dan looked at the crack. It ran from the guard to the middle of the blade. Thin, deep, like an old scar that refuses to heal. His fingers tingled. The resonance pulled him toward this blade, not toward the metal, toward what lay behind the metal, toward history, toward the father Kira had lost, toward the girl who grew up alongside a mercenary and learned to hold a sword before she could hold a spoon. Dan stood up and walked over to her. Kira looked up. Her gaze was wary. Dan asked her to give him the sword. Kira didn't move. She asked why. Dan said he wanted to look at it. Just look. Kira looked at him for a long time. Then she slowly laid the blade on the table. Dan took it in both hands and closed his eyes. The metal spoke, not with words, with sensations. Dan held the blade and felt its history as his own. The steel had been forged 20 years ago, not in a large forge, in a small one, a village one. The master worked alone. The hammer blows were uneven. The man forged not by a template, but by eye. He placed the strip on the anvil, turned it, struck again. He adjusted the balance to fit a specific hand, a broad, heavy palm, accustomed to holding a sword with a grip facing away from him. Kira's father was left-handed. Dan opened his eyes and looked at Kira. He asked if her father was left-handed. Kira flinched. Sora looked up from her bow. Yuna stopped stirring the soup. Kira answered that he was. How did he know Dan didn't explain? He closed his eyes again. The crack in the blade wasn't in a weak spot. It ran along the line of maximum stress, right where the blade took the hardest blows. For 20 years, this sword had protected its mistress. For 20 years, the crack had grown by a millimeter. And finally, the blade gave way. Not because the metal was bad, because it had given everything it had. The city blacksmith saw the crack and said the metal was tired. They were right. But they didn't understand the main thing. This metal wasn't tired from work. It was tired from not being repaired. No one listened to it. For 20 years, it had been screaming that it needed help. And for 20 years, they had only sharpened and polished it. Dan asked Yuna for a needle. She gave it to him without asking. He asked Sora for oil for the bowstring. Sora silently handed him the bottle. He asked the tavern owner for a piece of coal. The owner shrugged and brought it. Dan sat down at the table. He placed the blade in front of him and began to work. He wasn't forging. He had no forge, no hammer, no bellows. He had the fingers of a restorer and the resonance of a master. With the needle, he cleaned out the crack, removed the dirt from it, dust, microscopic particles of rust. He worked slowly, carefully, just as he had once cleaned the mechanism of an 18th century clock. He lubricated the blade along the crack with bowstring oil, not to make it slide, but so that the metal would remember what care felt like. It sounds silly, but that's exactly how the resonance worked. Things remembered, things felt, things wanted to be whole. He filled the crack with coal dust, carbon, the foundation of steel. He was returning to the blade what it was made of. Then he placed both palms on the blade and gave resonance. Not all of it. He didn't know how much was in him, but he gave as much as he could. And as he did so, he wasn't thinking about the metal. He was thinking about Kira, about the girl who had lost her father, about the woman who carried his sword as if he might return if she didn't let go of the hilt, about the crack that wasn't in the blade, but in her. The metal beneath his palms grew warm, then hot, then warm again. Dan opened his eyes. The crack was gone. The blade was whole. Not new. That's important. Not new. It still bore the scratches from 20 years of battle. The small nicks remained. Its entire history remained. But the crack had healed, along a line that hadn't been there in the original forging, along the line of the grip, along the line of how Kira held this blade. The sword had become a part of her. Not her father's sword, her sword, in which her father's memory lived on. Dan laid the blade on the table and leaned back. His hands were shaking. Sweat trickled down his face. He felt as if he'd been hauling rocks all day. Kira took the sword, gripped the hilt, lifted it, swung it, and froze. Dan saw how her face changed. First, disbelief, then surprise, then something for which he had no words. The sword fit perfectly in her hand. Not like before. Better. Before, she had held her father's sword. Now she held her own, the one that remembered her father. Kira slowly sank to the floor, right in the middle of the tavern. She pressed the blade to her chest, and she cried, quietly, silently. Tears simply streamed down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. Sora turned her face toward the wall. Yuna covered her mouth with her hand. The tavern owner froze with a mug in his hand and forgot what he was carrying too. Dan sat there, not knowing what to do with his hands. He repaired watches, music boxes, mechanisms and locks, but never, not in either of his 2 lives. He had never repaired a person, and this was exactly that. He hadn't repaired a sword. He had repaired Kira. A woman was standing on the tavern stairs. Dan hadn't noticed when she'd arrived. Tall, dark hair tied in a bun, intelligent, tired eyes. Evelyn Cross, Guildmaster, the one who, 3 years ago, had signed the authorization to take a useless rookie into the squad. She stood in the shadows and smiled, quietly, with just her lips, like a person who had bet everything on a single card and saw that the card had won. In the morning, Kira approached Dan. Her face was hard and mocking again. She said he was trapped, that now he couldn't go anywhere, that if he could do something like that, the squad wouldn't let him go, and that if he told anyone that she'd been crying, she'd personally finish him off. Dan nodded. He understood what that meant. Not a threat. Gratitude. In Kira's language. Yuna was next. She hugged him, tightly. She said he was amazing, and that he needed to eat properly because he looked like a skeleton. Sora was the last to approach. She didn't say anything. She just placed a small compass on the table in front of him, an old one, with a scratched glass face and a stuck needle. She looked at him and left. Dan picked up the compass. He turned it over in his hands. He felt it. This thing was dear to her, very dear, and she had entrusted it to him, silently, without requests, without explanations. She just put it down and left. Dan tucked the compass into his pocket. For 3 years, they'd put up with him out of pity, and now he was sitting at a table with people who looked at him differently, not like a burden, like something impossible, like a miracle they hadn't yet understood but didn't want to let go of. A week had passed. Dan returned to the Hall of Heritage. This time he went alone. The door opened at a single touch, as if it had been waiting. The hall looked different in the light. The blue lines on the ceiling glowed evenly. The mechanisms along the walls stood still, but they weren't scary, more like sad, like an abandoned workshop. Dan walked past rows of constructs. He stopped at one, small, a meter tall, stocky, a bronze body covered in green patina, a plaque on its back, numbers and symbols he couldn't read. But one number was clear, 7, Cobalt 7. Dan crouched down. He placed his palm on the construct's chest plate. A resonance flowed through his fingers. The world of this little guardian unfolded before him like a blueprint. An engine in its chest, an energy core the size of a fist, 4 joints in each leg, 3 in each arm, 16 gears in its head that once allowed it to think. Simple thoughts: guard, clean, carry, help. It wasn't a combat construct. It was a worker, a master's assistant. One of the first had made it for themselves, to hand tools and clear away shavings. Dan sensed this and smiled. In his past life, he had a dream. A wind-up assistant dog on a workbench that hands out screwdrivers. A silly dream, but his own. Cobalt 7 was broken in 3 places. First, the power core was drained almost to zero, 1,000 years without a recharge. Second, 3 gears in his head had snapped. That's why he couldn't think. Third, his right leg was jammed at the knee. The locking mechanism was covered in a growth of rust. Not ordinary rust. Rust. That very same distorted energy that was corroding everything around the dungeon. Rust. Dan touched the growth and pulled his hand back. His fingers tingled. For a second, he forgot his own name. Then he remembered. That's what rust does. It eats memory. It eats knowledge. It eats the connections between people and things. A blacksmith forgets how to forge. A mother forgets her child's name. A sword forgets who it was made for. Dan looked at his fingers. The tingling had passed. The resonance had protected him. Not completely, but enough. He realized he could work with this. He returned to the city and spent 3 days gathering what he needed. Tools from a junk shop. No one bought old files and pliers. Dan bought them for pennies. Oil. Not gun oil. Cooking oil. Yuna gave him 2 bottles without asking any questions. A piece of iron from the blacksmith's scrap. The blacksmith looked at him like he was crazy when Dan asked for that exact piece. Crooked, with dents, a reject. But Dan sensed potential in it. The right structure, the right composition. The metal wanted to become a gear. He returned to the hall, laid out his tools, sat down next to Cobalt 7, and began. 3 gears. He had to turn 3 gears out of a piece of defective iron, without a lathe, without a forge, with a file and pliers. 12 hours. He worked 12 hours straight. His fingers were rubbed raw and bleeding. Yuna came in 6 hours later and silently left food and bandages. Kira came in 10 hours later. She stood in the doorway. She left. Sora came 11 hours later. She handed him water. She took away the dirty bandages. She brought clean ones. She didn't say a word. Dan was grinding the gears. Every tooth, every groove. He wasn't making them from a blueprint. There was no blueprint. He was making them by feel, based on how the original gears fit inside Cobalt 7's head, based on how they were meant to move. The finished gears were ugly, rough, uneven. Any craftsman in this world would have looked at them and called them junk, but they were right. They fit. Dan inserted them one by one. Each clicked into place with a soft click, like a puzzle, as if they had always been there. Then the rust. He placed his palms on the construct's knee, on the growth of distorted energy. The tingling returned. He forgot the word. Hammer. He forgot the word hammer. Then he remembered. He clenched his teeth, and he poured resonance into the growth. Not force, not pressure, understanding. He felt the rust like a disease, like an infection. It was like the rotting of wood, like metal corrosion, like what happens to an object when it is forgotten. Rust was oblivion, physical oblivion, and it was cured by the same thing that cures oblivion: attention, care, memory. Dan remembered Cobalt 7, not as a mechanism, as someone's assistant, someone's little workshop partner. One of the firsts worked beside him every day. Every day told him what to hand him and where to put it. And when the firsts left, when the workshop emptied, Cobalt 7 was left alone for 1,000 years, and rust set in because he was forgotten. Warmth flowed through Dan's palms into his knee joint. The growth trembled, became brittle, crumbled to dust. Beneath it, the metal was clean, shiny, like new. Dan leaned back. His head was spinning. His hands were shaking. He had done it. He had cured the rust. For the first time in the history of this world, the core remained, an energy core that was discharged. Dan didn't know how to charge it. He had no energy source. He had no knowledge of how the first ones powered their constructs, but he had resonance. He placed his palm on Cobalt 7's chest. He found the core, a small sphere made of an unknown alloy, cold, dead. Dan closed his eyes. He thought of the workshop, of his workshop in his past life, of the lamp above the workbench, about the heat from the soldering iron, about how the transformer hummed in the corner, about how things came to life under his hands. And he passed that feeling to the core. The core accepted it, a click, a hum, quiet, steady. A green light flashed in Cobalt 7's eyes. The little construct twitched. It raised its head, looked at Dan, blinked, and held out its right hand, palm up, as if waiting for a tool, as if the master had finally returned. Dan laughed. For the first time in 3 years in this world, he laughed for real. He named the construct Bolt. Bolt turned out to be more useful than Dan could have imagined. The little construct didn't know how to fight and couldn't lift anything heavier than a blacksmith's hammer. But he remembered the hall. He remembered where everything was, which corridors led to the storerooms, where the first one's tools were kept, which doors were safe and which were booby-trapped. Bolt followed Dan like a shadow, 3 steps behind, head tilted slightly to the side. The green dots of his eyes tracked the master's every move. When Dan sat down to work, Bolt stood beside him. He held out his hand. He waited. The moment Dan reached for a file, Bolt was already holding it in his open palm. Una said it was the sweetest thing she'd ever seen. Kira said it was the creepiest. Sora said nothing, but Dan noticed she stroked Bolt's head when she thought no one was looking. During the first week, Dan set up his workshop. The Hall of Heritage was huge, but a single corner was enough for him. A workbench made of stone slabs, the first one's tools that Bolt had found in the warehouse. Strange, unfamiliar, but the resonance helped him understand each one at first touch. Pliers that adjusted themselves to the size of the part. A file whose surface changed from coarse to fine with pressure. A magnifying glass that didn't magnify, but revealed the internal structure of the material. Dan felt like a kid in a toy store. Every tool was a revelation. Each one opened up new possibilities. And every time he picked up something new, resonance absorbed it. Endless growth. Every object he grasped, every technique he mastered. Forever. He forgot nothing. On his second day in the workshop, he learned to use 3 tools created by the first 1,000 years ago. On the third day, 5 more. By the end of the week, he had mastered a set that no craftsman in this world could have mastered in years. And that was when he remembered Sora's compass. Small, brass, with a scratched glass face and a stuck needle. He took it out and placed it on the workbench. Resonance flowed into the metal. The compass was old, very old, older than Sora, older than her parents. It had been made by a master craftsman in a small port town. For a girl. Not for Sora. For someone who lived long ago. The compass had passed from hand to hand, from mother to daughter. 3 generations, 3 women. And every scratch on the glass was someone's story. This one, the long one, diagonal. The first owner dropped the compass on the ship's deck. This one, the round one, like from a blow. The second owner clenched it in her fist when she gave birth to her daughter. And the needle, a stuck needle. It hadn't stopped because it was broken. The axis was intact. The mechanism worked. The needle stopped because the compass had lost its owner. When Sora's mother died, the needle froze, as if it had nowhere left to point. Dan sat and looked at the compass. His fingers rested on the case. He sensed 3 generations of women who had passed this object from hand to hand, and a 4th, Sora, who carried the dead compass in her pocket, not for direction, for connection. He didn't fix the needle. He did something else. He imbued the axis with resonance. He didn't do it abstractly. He thought of Sora, of the quiet girl who saw everything and said nothing, who brought him water and took away the dirty bandages, who stroked Bolt's head when she thought no one was watching, who gave him her most precious possession without a word. The needle wavered and turned, not north, southeast. Dan didn't realize it at first, then it dawned on him. The workshop was south of the tavern, where Sora was sleeping now. The compass pointed to a home, not to a direction, to the place where its owner felt at home. Sora's mother had died, and the compass had stopped pointing because there was no home anymore. And now, a home had appeared again. Dan carefully wiped the glass. He didn't polish out the scratches. Each one was part of the story. He only replaced the cracked lid latch with a new one he had carved himself. A small detail, but now the lid closed with a soft click, just as it should. In the morning, he placed the compass on the table in front of Sora. The needle swayed and pointed at her. Sora opened the lid. She looked at the needle. She looked at Dan. Her eyes widened. She understood. Dan saw the moment when she understood. The needle wasn't pointing north. It was pointing to home. Sora closed the lid. She pressed the compass to her chest. She stood up from the table and left, quickly, without looking back. Kira watched her go. She turned to Dan. She said that if he kept this up, he was finished. Dan didn't understand. Kira didn't bother to explain. Yuna smiled and shook her head. Dan still didn't get what she meant. That same day, Evelyn Cross arrived. She appeared in the hall without warning. Bolt reacted first. He stood in front of Dan. He raised his hands. His green eyes turned orange. Evelyn looked at the construct, then at Dan, then at the workshop, at the first one's tools laid out on the stone workbench, at the blue lines on the ceiling that glowed brighter than they had a week ago. She said she was impressed. Dan said he was just working. Evelyn sat down on a stone ledge. She crossed her legs. She looked at him with that gaze that made novice adventurers start to stutter. Dan didn't stutter. He was too busy cleaning his file. Evelyn said the rumors had already started, that people at the tavern had seen a useless rookie from the Valan squad repair a sword with his bare hands, that blacksmiths were arguing about how he'd done it, that some big guilds had started asking questions. Dan stopped cleaning the file. Evelyn said she needed to know what he was capable of, not for herself, to protect him, because a man who repairs artifacts of the first is not just a valuable craftsman, he is a target. Dan was silent for a long time. Then he told her. Not everything, not about his past life, but about resonance, about how he senses things, about the rust he had healed, about Bolt. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was silent for a minute. Then she said one thing. She said she knew his gift was real when she saw Kira crying, because Kira hadn't cried since she was 12. Evelyn stood up. She smoothed out her cloak. She said he could work in peace, that she would protect him from those who wanted to get their hands on him, that she had enough influence in the guild to buy him some time. But time wasn't infinite. Sooner or later, those she couldn't stop would come for him. Dan asked how much time he had. Evelyn replied that if he kept a low profile, maybe a month or 2. If the rumors spread, a week. She left. Bolt walked her to the door and returned to Dan. He sat down next to him. He handed him a file. Dan took the tool. He looked at the hall. at the dead rows of constructs, at the great mechanism in the center, at the cracks and rust, at 1,000 years of desolation. A month or two, or a week. He understood that Evelyn hadn't been exaggerating. The world of Arkandale operated on simple rules. Power is subjugated, benefits are bought, and whatever cannot be subjugated or bought is destroyed so that others cannot have it. His gift could not be subjugated because it did not function under duress. It could not be bought because the stamp killed the resonance. Which meant there was a third option. Dan gripped the file. His hands weren't shaking. For the first time in 3 years, they weren't shaking. He looked at Bolt. The construct tilted its head to the side. The green dots flickered, as if asking what was next. Dan replied that next, they would work, that they had time, and a hall full of broken things that had been waiting for 1,000 years, and that he wasn't going to make them wait any longer. Bolt straightened up. He handed over the next tool, and the master returned to his work. Rumors spread faster than Evelyn had thought. 10 days after Kyra's sword was repaired, the first recruiter arrived in town. Dan found out about it from Yuna. She returned from the market with a basket of herbs and a look on her face that made it clear something bad had happened. She said that in the guild quarter, a man in an expensive cloak had been questioning the blacksmiths. He asked about a master who repairs things with his bare hands. He asked for a name. He asked where to find him. The blacksmiths didn't, not out of loyalty to Dan, out of resentment. They didn't believe that some kid without a bellows or an anvil could do what they couldn't, and so, speaking of him was beneath their dignity. This resentment bought Dan a few more days, but the recruiter didn't leave. His name was Torrin Marks. He worked for the Vane Trading House, one of the largest in Arkandale. The head of the house, Garland Vane, collected artifacts of the first ones the way others collect coins, not for beauty, for power. Every artifact in his collection was a weapon, or could become a weapon, or contain knowledge that could be turned into a weapon. A man capable of repairing such things was more important to Garland Vane than an entire army. Torrin Marks went from tavern to tavern. He bought drinks, asked questions, paid for answers. 3 days later, he knew a name. Dan So. 5 days later, he knew about the Velen squad. A week later, he knew about the hall. Kira came to Dan that evening. She tossed the scroll onto the workbench. A contract. Torrin Marks had left it at the tavern. The golden seal of the Vane house. Numbers that made her eyes spin. A lifetime's worth of provisions. Her own workshop in the capital. Access to any materials. Security. Servants. The title of courtmaster. In exchange for working exclusively for the House of Vane. Kira said the price was good. Then she said that if he signed it, she would personally break both his arms. Dan unrolled the scroll, read it, put it back. He didn't consider the offer for a single second. Not out of pride, and not because the terms were bad. They were excellent, for someone else. Dan knew what would happen if he accepted. A workshop in the capital, orders from the House of Vanes, artifacts of the first ones, one after another. Fix this, now this, now this, faster, more. For whom? For the market, for war, for a collection, for abstract progress. The resonance would suffocate by the 3rd week. The gift only worked when he was repairing for someone specific, for a living person with a living history, for Kara and her father, for Sora and her mother, for little Bolt, who had waited 1,000 years for a master. Mass production was killing the gift. The golden cage was beautiful, but it was a cage, and inside it, resonance would simply fall silent. Dan told Kira he wouldn't sign. Kira nodded. She put the contract away. Something resembling relief flashed across her face. Torrin Marks came the next day, in person, to the gates of the hall. Bolt stood in the doorway and wouldn't let him in. The small construct spread its arms and flashed its orange eyes, 1 meter tall against a man twice its size. Torrin laughed. Then he stopped laughing when Kara stood behind Bolt with her sword drawn, and Sora behind her with a bow, and Yuna in the doorway with an expression that made it clear. This herbalist knows which poisons in what doses cause what. Torrin raised his hands. He said he'd come to talk. No threats. Dan came out of the workshop. His hands were stained with oil. A towel was draped over his shoulder. Bolt immediately ran over to him and stood beside him. Torin looked at him curiously. He said the offer was generous. He said Garland Vane wasn't the type to take no for an answer easily. He said it was better to agree while they were still asking politely. Dan replied that he appreciated the offer, but his gift didn't work the way Torin thought. He couldn't churn out work. He couldn't work on commission. He couldn't fix things for someone he didn't know. Torin replied that this could be discussed, that the terms were flexible, that Garland Wayne was a reasonable man. Dan shook his head. Torin was silent for a moment. Then he smiled. It was a professional smile. Torin said he would pass on the answer, that Garland Wayne would certainly understand, and he left. Kira sheathed her sword. She said that this man lies as easily as he breathes, that Garland Wayne won't understand, that the next visit won't be with a contract, but with mercenaries. Dan knew she was right. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in the workshop. Bolt was nearby. Green eyes glinted in the darkness. Dan looked at the great mechanism in the center of the hall, a massive structure, broken, unfinished. The first ones hadn't managed to finish it, or hadn't wanted to, or hadn't been able to. He could feel it even from here, every gear, every shaft, every pipe. And what was missing? Voids, holes in the structure, places where parts should have been but weren't. The great mechanism was like a song from which half the notes had been torn out. The melody could be guessed at, but could not be heard. Dan closed his eyes and asked himself the question that had haunted him from day one. What does this mechanism do? Why did the first ones build it? And why didn't they finish it? Bolt tapped him on the knee. He held out a wrench. Dan took it. He looked at the little construct. Bolt didn't know the answer, but he knew the master needed a tool. That was enough. Wren appeared on the 12th day. Dan found her at the gate to the hall. She was sitting on a rock, thin, dirty. Her clothes were torn. Her hands were scraped. Her face had the expression of a wild cat that hadn't decided whether to bite or run away. She was 18, maybe younger. Hard to say. Hunger makes people look older. Bolt saw her first. His eyes turned orange. He stood between her and the entrance to the hall. Dan crouched down in front of her. She recoiled, said she didn't need anything, told him not to look at her, said she was just waiting out the rain. There was no rain. Dan didn't argue. He stood up. He went back to the workshop. An hour later, he came out again. She was sitting on the same rock. Dan set a bowl of soup in front of her, the soup Yuna had left that morning, and he left. 20 minutes later, the bowl was empty. 2 hours later, she was standing at the entrance to the hall, watching him work. Her eyes were like those of a hungry beast, but her hunger wasn't just physical. She looked at the workshop, at the tools, at Bolt, who was handing him wrenches, at the way Dan's hands moved across the metal. With the hunger children feel in front of a locked display case. She wants it. She doesn't believe it's possible. Dan didn't call her inside. He didn't ask her questions. He didn't pressure her. He just worked. On the second day, she came closer. On the third, she sat down on a stone ledge 10 paces from the workbench. On the fourth day, she asked what he was doing. Dan explained. He was cleaning the lock mechanism from one of the inner doors of the hall. He showed her how the pin tumbler mechanism worked, how the spring presses on the latch, how dirt clogs the channel and the lock stops working. She listened without blinking. She asked if she could touch it. Dan handed her the lock. She took it with both hands, carefully, as if it were a living thing. She turned it over. She touched the spring. She pressed the latch, and said the spring was too stiff for such a small channel. Dan looked at her. She was right. He asked how she knew. She shrugged, said she could just tell. Dan nodded, didn't ask any more questions. On the 5th day, he learned her name, Wren. Just Wren, no last name. A disposable mercenary. That's what they called the kids they hired for food to do the dirtiest work. To check if a corridor was booby-trapped, to crawl through a narrow crawl space, to lure out a construct. If the kids survived, they got a bowl of porridge. If not, They hired the next one. Ren survived. She'd been surviving for 5 years, and now she was sitting on a rock in front of his workshop because her latest employer had decided she was too old for the narrow crawl spaces and had kicked her out. Kira found out about Ren on the 6th day. She came over. She looked at the girl. She looked at Dan. Her face froze. She said he picked up stray constructs and stray people at the same rate. Then she left and came back with a blanket and a change of clothes. Yuna came in the evening. She brought food. She examined the scrapes. Ren wouldn't let her. She hissed and fought back. Yuna didn't insist. She left some ointment and bandages. Ren waited until everyone had left and bandaged herself. Sora brought her a bow, an old one, a spare. She said it was better to be armed in these dungeons. Ren took the bow silently, pressed it to her chest. She looked at Sora as if expecting a catch. Sora left without looking back. There was no catch. Ren couldn't believe it. On the 7th day, she approached Dan and said she would stay. She didn't ask. She announced it. She said she would work, that she was small and could squeeze into places he couldn't, that she knew the dungeons better than any adventurer, that she was useful. She uttered that word like a spell. Useful. As if it were the only thing protecting her from the world. As long as you're useful, they won't kick you out. Dan said she didn't need to be useful, that she could just stay. Ren looked at him. Confusion. Pure. Absolute. As if he'd said something in a foreign language. She replied that it didn't work that way. Dan didn't argue. He said that if she wanted to help, then she should help. But not because she had to, because she wanted to. Ren said nothing, but she stayed. That evening, Dan noticed she was hiding something under her jacket, something small. She pressed it close to her when she thought no one was watching. Bolt saw it. The little construct walked up to her and nudged her knee with his head. Ren jumped back. Then she looked at him. Bolt blinked his green eyes. He held out his paw. Ren didn't move. Bolt stood there, waiting, the way only constructs know how to wait, without impatience, without pressure. He just stood there with his paw outstretched. Ren slowly pulled a small object from under her jacket, a wooden figurine, an animal, either a cat or a fox, roughly carved. One paw was broken off. The paint was almost completely worn away. A child's toy. She placed it in Bolt's palm. The construct turned and carried the figurine to Dan. Dan took it. He looked at Ren. She was standing 5 paces away, looking at him with an expression he had seen only once in his life, in a past life, when an old woman had brought him her late husband's watch and said, "Please, just don't throw it away if you can't fix it." Dan placed the figurine on the workbench. A resonance flowed into the wood. He could feel it. Cherry. A soft wood. Carved by someone unskilled. A dull knife. Cuts on the fingers. A man. Large hands. A hand accustomed to a weapon, not a knife. He carved by candlelight in the evening. He was in a hurry. He wanted to finish before morning. For a child. For a little girl who had asked for a fox. Not a cat, a fox, because foxes are cunning and fast, like her. It was a father, not an employer, not a master, Ren's father. He carved a toy for his daughter before leaving on a mission, and he never came back. Dan sat motionless. His hands rested on the figurine. He could feel the wood. He could feel the knife marks. He could feel the haste and tenderness of a man who knew he might not return and wanted to leave his daughter at least something, a broken paw. Dan found a piece of cherry wood in the workshop. Bolt brought a carving knife. Dan carved a paw, a small one. He adjusted it to fit. He sanded it down. He set it against the figure's body. Resonance. He poured into the joint what he felt from the wood. A father's care. Haste and tenderness. The paw grew back, not with glue, not with a nail. It fused with the body as if it had never been broken off. Dan didn't repaint it. He didn't polish it. He left every chip, every unevenness. He just put the paw back on and added one thing. He put warmth into the wood, The resonance burned in his palms. The figurine became warm, not hot, warm, like the palm of a living person, and that warmth didn't fade. He placed the fox on the edge of the workbench. Ren stood and watched. She didn't come closer. Dan stood up and walked away. He went to do something else. Bolt followed him. Ren waited. She approached. She picked up the figurine and froze. Dan wasn't looking, but he heard it. A quiet, raspy sound, as if someone were trying to breathe and couldn't. He didn't turn around. He gave her time. When he finally did turn around, Ren was sitting on the floor. She was pressing the fox to her cheek. Her eyes were red. Her face was wet. She didn't say anything. Bolt stood next to her, quietly blinking his green eyes. The first month was coming to an end. The workshop was up and running. Dan repaired things every day. Not artifacts of the first ones, not yet. Ordinary things. A broken lock on a tavern door. A cracked axle on a merchant's cart. A leaky kettle in Yuna's kitchen. He did it for free. Not out of nobility, out of necessity. Every repair trained the resonance. Every item added a grain to his mastery. And every item he repaired for a specific person made him a little stronger. Endless growth. Not in the force of a blow, in the depth of understanding. The town was getting used to him. At first, they came with distrust. The merchant dragged over a broken axle and stood nearby all evening, certain the boy would ruin everything. In the morning, he picked up the cart. The axle held. The cart didn't creak. The merchant left in silence. He returned 3 days later. He brought another cart. Then the tavern keeper. Then the tanner. Then the potter. Dan didn't turn anyone away. Everyone who came told him about their item. Not because Dan asked, because he listened. The merchant told him his grandfather had built that cart. The landlady told him the cauldron had come to her from her mother. The tanner told him the carving knife was the only tool he'd ever received from his teacher, and Dan repaired them. Each item as if it were the only one, each as if someone's life depended on it, because that was exactly the case. Not life, memory, connection, that invisible thing that keeps people afloat when everything else is falling apart. Yuna came every day. She brought food. She checked to see if he'd overworked himself. He had. Every time. She scolded him. He nodded, kept working. In the third week, Yuna came and set her mortar on the workbench. Stone, heavy, for grinding herbs. A crack at the bottom, a thin one, barely noticeable. But because of it, the powder spilled through the crack. Yuna said it was nothing, that she could buy a new one, that it wasn't worth wasting time on. Dan looked at her. Yuna looked away. He picked up the mortar. Resonance. The stone was old, granite from the riverbank. A master stonemason had shaped it, not for sale, for his wife, who was a herbalist, like Yuna. 3 generations of healers had used this mortar. 3 generations of women who healed everyone around them and forgot about themselves. The crack didn't come from a blow, from wear and tear. The stone was tired, just like each of its owners. Dan worked for 2 hours, not because the crack was difficult, because he wanted to do it right. He didn't fill it with cement or glue. He found a mineral in the first one's warehouse that looked like granite, but was stronger. He ground it into dust, mixed it with oil, packed it into the crack, and gave it resonance. He thought of Yuna, of the woman who fed 5 people every day, bandaged wounds, checked pupils, scolded Dan for not eating. She scolded Kira for fighting without a shield. She scolded Ren for not washing her hands. And yet she never once asked anyone to take care of her. The mortar became whole again. The crack disappeared. But a thin line remained where the seam had been, silvery, as if someone had drawn a thread of light along the bottom. Dan looked at it. He hadn't planned it. The resonance decided on its own. The line was beautiful. It didn't hide the crack. It turned it into an ornament, a reminder. You were broken. You were fixed. And the scar became part of the beauty. Dan handed the mortar to Yuna. She took it, turned it over, saw the silvery line, ran her finger along it, looked up at Dan, and for the first time in all the time he'd known her, in all 3 years, Yuna Han didn't know what to say. She just stood there, holding the mortar, and looked at the silvery line where the crack had run. And Dan saw in her eyes what he had seen in Kyra's eyes when she took the repaired sword. Understanding. Not of the mortar, of herself. Yuna exhaled. She said thank you, quietly, without her usual fussing and motherly grumbling. Just thank you. Like a person, not a healer. She left. She turned around at the door. She said there would be soup tomorrow, and that he should eat. That was all. Dan smiled. Bolt handed him a rag to wipe his hands. Ren sat in her corner and watched Dan. She looked at him like that every time he fixed something for someone, with hunger, not material hunger. She was trying to understand why he did it, for what purpose, what he got out of it, and she couldn't find an answer, because there wasn't one. He did it because he knew how, because things asked him to, because people brought him their cracks disguised as broken objects, and he fixed both. By the end of the month, Evelyn came again. This time, she wasn't alone. With her was a man Dan didn't know, short, bald, hands scarred from burns, a blacksmith, the guild's senior blacksmith. His name was Goran. Goran looked around the workshop, at the tools of the first, at Bolt, at the workbench with a dozen items waiting to be repaired. His face showed nothing. Evelyn said that Goran wanted to see. Dan asked what exactly. Goran spoke for the first time. His voice was like sandpaper on metal. He said he didn't believe it, that it was impossible to repair a sword without a forge was impossible, that mending a crack in granite by hand was impossible, that it was all tricks and quackery, and that he'd come to see for himself. Dan wasn't offended. He understood. Goran was a master, a true one. 30 years at the forge, his hands knew metal, and now some kid comes along and does what a master with 30 years of experience can't. It's not resentment, it's pain. Dan asked Goran for something broken, something of his own. Goran silently took a chain from around his neck. A ring hung from it, simple, iron, bent, with a deep dent. He placed it on the workbench. Dan picked up the ring. Resonance, iron, simple, pure, hand-forged, with a single blow, masterful, perfect. Goran had forged this ring himself, long ago,
When he was young, for a woman.
who had left. The dent appeared when he threw the ring at the wall in a rage, and then he picked it up, and never took it off again. 20 years. Dan placed the ring in his palm. He closed his eyes. He didn't fix the dent. Goran could have done it himself, with a single blow of the hammer, but he hadn't done so in 20 years, because the dent was part of the story. Dan did something else. He infused resonance into the metal and asked the ring what it wanted to be. The ring answered. It wanted to be what it was at the moment of forging, not at the moment of being thrown, at the moment when the young blacksmith poured everything he felt into a single blow. And Dan gave that back to him, not the shape, the feeling. The metal warmed beneath his fingers. The dent remained, but the ring had changed. Goran took it back, slipped it onto his finger. He froze. His face twitched, just for a second. Then it turned to stone again. He turned to Evelyn, said one word, "Real," and left. Evelyn looked at Dan, said that Goran was now on his side, that the word of the senior blacksmith in the guild carried more weight than 10 contracts, that it mattered, because Torin Marks had left, but he'd be back soon, and not alone. Torin Marks returned 2 weeks later, not alone. He had 12 mercenaries with him, professionals, heavy armor, swords at their belts, and a wagon, a covered one, with a lock. Dan found out about it from Ren. She was the first to see them. The girl knew the city like the back of her hand. Every alley, every courtyard, every rooftop you could run across. She burst into the workshop, out of breath, and said they were coming here, right now. Dan put down his tools. Bolt jumped to his feet, eyes orange. Kira was in the workshop. She heard, stood up, hand on the hilt of her sword, face calm. She'd been expecting this, preparing. For 2 weeks, she'd been training with the repaired blade. The balance had changed after the repair, and she'd had to get used to it. She'd gotten used to it. Sora heard through the open window. She came silently, as always, bow in hand, quiver on her back. She took up a position on the rocky ledge above the entrance to the hall. From there, she could see the entire approach. Yuna gathered supplies, bandages, ointments, potions, 2 vials of something she didn't care to explain. Ren grabbed the bow Sora had given her. Her hands were shaking, but she stood next to Kyra. Dan looked at them, 5 women, ready to fight for him. 3 months ago, they'd dragged him along out of pity. 2 months ago, they'd seen what he was capable of. A month ago, they'd decided to stay. And now they stood between him and 12 mercenaries in heavy armor, not out of pity. He felt it as resonance, not through metal, through people. They were standing there because they wanted to. Torrin Marks rode up to the hall's gates on horseback, dismounted, looked around, saw Sora on the rock, saw Kira with her sword, smiled, said he didn't want any trouble, that he'd come to talk. Kira replied that 12 mercenaries were a strange way to start a conversation. Torrin spread his hands. He said the roads were unsafe, that they were just security, that he had brought something for Master So, a gift from Garland Wayne. He snapped his fingers. 2 mercenaries opened the wagon. They pulled out a chest, heavy, wooden. They set it on the ground. Torrin opened the lid. Inside lay an artifact. Dan sensed it from 10 paces away. The resonance struck his chest like a fist. It was an object of the first ones, ancient, powerful, broken. He didn't know what it was, but every cell in his body screamed that he had to touch it, had to understand it, had to fix it. Torrin looked at his face and smiled. He knew. He knew the master wouldn't be able to walk past it. Torrin said it had been found in a deep dungeon in the north, that no one knew what it was, that the House of Vanes wanted Dan to determine its purpose, repair it if he could, and keep it as a fee. No contract, no obligations, just a gift. Generous, selfless, a trap. Kira saw it. Sora saw it. Yuna saw it. Even Ren, who was 18 and didn't understand politics, saw it. Dan saw it too. But the artifact sang to him. He felt the mechanism inside, felt the gears, felt a purpose so close he could almost touch it. He took a step toward the box. Kira grabbed his shoulder. Her grip was iron. She didn't say anything. She just held on. Dan stopped, closed his eyes, exhaled. The resonance pulsed in his fingers. It was pulling him toward the artifact, like a hungry man toward food, like someone freezing toward a fire. He clenched his fists, told Torrin he didn't accept gifts. Torrin raised an eyebrow, asked why. Dan opened his eyes, looked at the recruiter, said that a gift without a reason was an advance, and an advance was a debt, and a debt to the House of Vanes was a chain. Torrin stopped smiling, for a second. Then the smile returned, a different one, a hard one. He said that Garland Vane would be upset. He said that Garland Vane wasn't used to being refused. He said there wouldn't be a third offer. There would be a decision. Dan replied that he understood. Torrin nodded. He snapped his fingers. The mercenaries took away the crate. They closed the wagon. Torrin mounted his horse. He looked down at Dan. He said one thing. He said that Garland Wayne would come himself, and that when Garland Wayne comes himself, it means the time for talking is over. He rode off. The dust settled. Silence. Kira took her hand off Dan's shoulder. He turned to her. She was looking at him, not with pity, not with mockery, with something new. He didn't realize what it was at first. Then he understood. Respect. He had resisted what he wanted more than anything in the world, resisted the artifact that sang to him, resisted the thing his hands longed to repair. He resisted because he saw the trap. He resisted because there were people standing beside him who were worth resisting for. Ren approached. She tugged at his arm. She asked what would happen when Garland Vane arrived. Dan looked at her. He didn't know what to say. Yuna answered for him. She said that when Garland Wayne arrived, they would be here. That was all. Sora nodded from the ledge. Kira placed her hand on the hilt of the repaired sword. Bolt handed Dan a wrench. Dan took it. He returned to the workshop. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the resonance that was still pulsing through his fingers, demanding he return to the box, to the artifact, to the song he hadn't finished listening to. He sat down at the workbench, closed his eyes, inhaled, exhaled, opened his eyes. Before him on the workbench lay the mechanism from the inner door of the hall, half disassembled, waiting. Dan picked up a file and got back to work. Not to the great artifacts, not to the weapons of war, to the broken door lock, because that lock was his, and that hall was his, and those people behind him were his, and everything else could wait. Dan spent the 3 days after Torn's departure underground, not in the workshop, deeper, in the hall's corridors that led downward. Bolt guided him. The little construct knew the way. His memory held a map of these tunnels, though he had forgotten most of it over 1,000 years. Snippets, fragments. He paused at the forks. His eyes flickered. He turned his head left and right. He remembered, and moved on. Ren followed them. Dan tried to leave her upstairs. She refused, said she knew the dungeons, that she could squeeze through places he couldn't, that she'd be useful. That word again. Dan didn't argue. Kira brought up the rear, sword in hand. Her eyes scanned every corner, every shadow. She didn't trust these walls, and she was right. On the 3rd level they found rust, an entire corridor, the walls covered in brown growths, the air thick and heavy. Kyra stopped at the threshold. Her face went pale. She said what she was feeling, a heaviness in her head, like fog. Dan felt it too. The rust was pressing down, not on the body, on the memory, on the thoughts. He took a step into the corridor. Kira grabbed his arm. He said he had to. She wouldn't let go. He looked at her. He said that was why he was here. She clenched her jaw. Let go. Dan stepped into the hallway. The rust pounced on him. He forgot the name of the tool he was holding in his right hand. A file. He forgot the word file. Then he remembered. Took another step. Forgot a name. Kira. No, he remembered. Kira. Another step. He forgot why he had come. He remembered. To fix it. He had come to fix it. A resonance flared in his palms, like a shield, like a barrier. The rust retreated. Not far, half a step. But that was enough to clear his head. Dan placed his hands on the wall. The growth beneath his palms was hot, alive. It pulsed, like a diseased organ, like an inflamed wound. The rust wasn't evil. Dan had realized that back when he was fixing Bolt. The rust was a symptom, a disease. The dungeon was sick, like a machine that hadn't been serviced in 1,000 years. The oil had dried up. The gears were worn down. The pipes had burst. And instead of functioning normally, rot had seeped out of the mechanism. He could feel it through the wall, the entire, kilometers of corridors, thousands of mechanisms, millions of parts, all dying, all calling out. And something else, deeper, beneath the layers of stone and metal, beneath the rust and dust. A voice, not a word, a sensation, as if someone tearful was whispering, "Please." Dan pulled his hands away. Sweat was streaming down his face. His heart was pounding. He saw it. For a second, for a split second. A face. In the rust. In the growth on the wall. A human face. Distorted. Blurred. But a face. Alive. Someone was inside the rust. Someone from the first ones. Kira asked from the doorway what had happened. Dan didn't answer right away. He was staring at the wall. At the growth. The face had vanished. The rust pulsed steadily, as if nothing had happened. But he had seen it. He had definitely seen it. Dan returned to the doorway. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. Kira grabbed him by the shoulders. Yuna, who had been waiting one level above, was already running down. Ren stood with her eyes wide open. The light was flashing red. Alarm. Dan said that the rust wasn't just a disease, that there's someone inside it, Someone from among those who built all this. Kira asked again. Dan repeated himself. The first ones didn't disappear. They didn't die. They didn't leave. They dissolved into their creations, into stone, into metal, into mechanisms. When people stopped understanding them, when the world forgot why all this was built, the first ones became part of the rust. And now they're calling. Through every breakdown, through every malfunction, through every construct that goes mad and spills out onto the surface. They don't attack. They're screaming for help. Silence. Kira stood there, staring at him. Yuna froze on the stairs. Ren clutched the wooden fox to her chest. The bolt slowly stopped flashing red. It turned green again. Dan exhaled. He said that this changes everything. That the guilds that slaughter constructs aren't healing the world. They're making it worse. Every guard killed is one voice silenced. Every cleared dungeon is one library burned. The world isn't saved by the sword. The world is fixed, and he's the only one who can do it. Kira was silent for a long time. Then she said that was too much, that one person couldn't fix the whole world. Dan replied that he wasn't going to fix the whole world. He was going to start with a single corridor. They returned to the workshop. Dan sat down at the workbench. He unfolded a piece of leather. Tools lay on it, the ones he'd been collecting for a month, the ones he'd found in the first's warehouses, the ones he'd made himself. He looked at Bolt, asked if there was anything in the warehouses for cleaning pipes. Bolt blinked, ran off, returned 10 minutes later with a device resembling a long, flexible arm with a brush on the end. Dan took it. Resonance. The device told him about itself. A duct cleaner. The first used these to maintain the ventilation and energy circulation systems in the dungeons. That's what it does. Cleans the ducts. Allows energy to flow properly. And if energy flows properly, rust doesn't form. Dan understood. Rust appears where the flow is disrupted, just as mold appears where there is no air circulation. He could treat rust in specific spots. He'd proven that on Bolt. But that's like mopping up water from the floor without turning off the faucet. The system needs to be restored. The channels, the pipes, the circulation. Then the rust will stop growing, and the existing rust will begin to dissolve on its own. It was a job that would take months, maybe years. One dungeon, just one, and there are hundreds of them in the world. Dan closed his eyes. He remembered the face in the rust, distorted, suffering, waiting 1,000 years. He opened his eyes. He picked up the drain cleaner. He turned toward the exit. Ren stood up and followed him. Kira sighed. She raised her sword. She followed. Bolt ran ahead. The four of them descended into the dark corridor. The master, the swordswoman, the girl, and the small construct with green eyes. Dan started with one pipe, the first one from the entrance to the rusty corridor. He cleaned it with the cleaner, then with his hands, then with resonance. Dirt and growths came out in clumps. Beneath them, the metal was clean, alive. He moved on to the second pipe, to the third, to the fourth. Kira stood guard. Ren shone a lantern. Bolt handed the tools. 6 hours later, the first section of the corridor was clear. 20 meters. 20 meters out of kilometers. But those 20 meters were breathing. The blue lines on the walls lit up. Dimly, but they lit up. The rust at the edge of the cleared section trembled. It retreated a centimeter. 1 centimeter. Dan looked at that centimeter and smiled. 1 centimeter. The beginning. Garland Wayne arrived at dawn, without warning, without recruiters, alone. Dan knew about him before he saw him. Bolt woke up in the middle of the night, eyes red, alarm. The little construct sensed a vibration in the stone. Many legs, many hooves, many wheels. A caravan. Ren slipped outside and returned an hour later. Her face was ashen. She said a convoy was moving toward the dungeon. 30 mercenaries, 2 closed wagons, a carriage bearing the Vane family crest, and a man riding a raven-black horse at the head of the column. Tall, broad-shouldered, graying temples, a fur-lined cloak, Garland Vane, head of the Trade and Military House, collector of First One's artifacts, a man who takes no for an answer. Dan didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat at his workbench, hands on his knees, thinking. Nowhere to run. The Hall of Heritage is tied to the dungeon. The workshop is tied to the hall. Everything he's built over these months is here. Tools, a bolt, cleared corridors, 200 meters reclaimed from the rust. The great mechanism, which he's begun to understand piece by piece. To abandon this meant abandoning everything, to start over. Somewhere, from scratch, without tools, without protection. And Garland Wayne would find him again, because people like Garland Wayne always find you. There was only one thing left to do: stand his ground. Kira came first. She sat down silently beside him. She laid her sword on her lap. She didn't ask. She didn't offer comfort. She just was there. Sora took her position while it was still dark. Dan couldn't see her, but he knew she was on the cliff. She could see every meter of the approach. Yuna laid out the supplies: bandages, vials, a needle and thread. She was preparing to patch up the living. Ren had curled up in a corner of the workshop. She was clutching the fox to her chest. Her eyes were dry. Her face was stony. She knew what it was like when strong people came. She knew how it ended, always the same. Evelyn showed up an hour before dawn. Dan wasn't expecting her. She strode into the hall. Her cloak was wet with dew. She'd been riding all night. She said she'd found out late that Garland Wayne hadn't warned the guild, hadn't asked for permission. He'd arrived like a master. That meant he didn't give a damn about politics. He didn't care about Evelyn or her influence. He wanted a master, and he would take a master. Dan asked what their chances were. Evelyn answered honestly. In open combat, 0. Wayne's 30 mercenaries weren't some village guard. They were veterans. Each had cleared dozens of dungeons. Each had killed constructs the size of a house. Kyra is strong. Sora is precise. But it's 5 of them against 30. The math is simple. Dan nodded. He stood up. He walked into the depths of the hall. Kyra called out to him. He didn't stop. He walked past the workbench, past the shelves of tools, past rows of dead constructs. He stood before the great mechanism. He placed his palms on the cold metal. Resonance flowed through his fingers. He had been studying this mechanism for a month and a half, several hours every day. He knew every gear, every shaft, every pipe. He knew where parts were in place, where they were missing, where they were damaged. The great mechanism was the heart of the dungeon. If it were started, it would cleanse everything, every corridor, every room, every inch of rust. The constructs would awaken, the guards would rise, the dungeon would come alive. But the mechanism was incomplete. The first ones didn't make it in time, or couldn't. 3 key components were missing. 3 places in the structure where voids gaped. 3 parts that had never existed. Dan stood and looked at these voids. He knew their shape. He knew their size. He knew their function. The voice of the material whispered to him what should be. But to create 3 parts from scratch in a few hours, it was impossible. He closed his eyes. He thought. His hands rested on the mechanism. And the mechanism responded, not with words, with shapes, with images. Dan saw it. The first's warehouse, the lower level, a room Bolt didn't remember. Or perhaps he remembered it but couldn't find it. Blanks, unfinished parts. The first ones had started making these assemblies. Started, but didn't finish. The blanks had been lying there for 1,000 years, waiting for a master. Dan opened his eyes, turned to Bolt, asked about the lower warehouse, the 5th level, a room behind a double door marked with a gear symbol. Bolt blinked. 1, 2, 3. He was remembering. Then his eyes turned bright green. He remembered. He ran. Dan followed him. Ren followed Dan. Kira called after them, asking where they were going. Dan shouted that he'd be back soon. 5 levels down. Stairs, corridors, dust, darkness. Bolt ran confidently. His little feet pounded against the stone. Green eyes lit the way. Double doors, a gear symbol, a lock. Dan placed his palm on it. A resonance, a click. The door opened. A room, small. Shelves along the walls. On them, blanks. Dozens of blanks. Gears, shafts, rings, tubes. All unfinished, all waiting. Dan walked along the shelves. His hands slid over the metal. Resonance read every detail. Here, this one, and this one, and this one. 3 blanks for the 3 missing components of the great mechanism. Unfinished, but started. There was a design in them. There was a form in them. All they lacked was a master. Dan grabbed all 3, heavy. Ren snatched one, Bolt the second, Dan the third. They ran upstairs, 5 levels, stairs, corridors, sweat, the weight. They burst into the hall. Voices could already be heard from outside. Garland Wayne had arrived. His mercenaries surrounded the entrance. Kira stood at the gate, sword in hand, face like stone. Sora on the rock, arrow on the bowstring. Yuna behind them. Evelyn next to Kira. She was speaking, her voice calm, formal. She reminded Garland that the hall was under the guild's jurisdiction, that the intrusion was a violation of the charter, that there would be consequences. A voice from outside, deep, steady, calm. Garland Wayne replied that the charter protected adventurers, and Master So was no adventurer. He had failed the exam 3 times. Legally, he was a nobody, and the hall belonged to no one, which meant there was nothing to protect. Evelyn fell silent. He was right, formally, legally. Dan rushed to the great mechanism. He laid the work pieces on the floor. 3 parts, unfinished, needing refinement. That would take days, weeks. He had neither days nor weeks. He had minutes. Garland's voice from outside. He said he was giving him 5 minutes. Then his men would come in. He didn't want violence, but he wouldn't stop either. 5 minutes. Dan looked at the parts, looked at the mechanism, looked at his hands. He couldn't finish 3 parts in 5 minutes. He couldn't. No master could. But resonance didn't work by the rules of craftsmanship. Resonance worked by the rules of care. And the stronger the care, the more impossible the result. Dan closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about the parts, not about the gears, not about the mechanism. He thought about Kira standing at the gate with a sword, about the swordswoman who had dragged him along out of pity for 3 years and now stood ready to die because he had repaired her father's blade. He thought about Sora on the cliff, about the quiet archer who had given him her most precious possession in silence and walked away without looking back. He thought of Yuna, who had fed and healed and scolded him every day, and for the first time received something in return. Of the silvery line on the stone mortar. He thought of Ren, who stood nearby, clutching a warm wooden fox to her chest. Of the girl whom the world had used and discarded, and who, for the first time in her life, didn't want to run away. He thought of me, about the keeper whom he had not yet fully awakened, about the lonely soul who had waited 1,000 years in the empty hall. He thought of Evelyn, who had bet on him out of desperation and wanted to be proven wrong in her own cynicism. He thought of Bolt, of the little construct who had reached out with a tool into the void for 1,000 years and had finally waited. He thought of everyone, by name, like an order, as always, because resonance worked only that way, not for an abstract world, for specific people, whom he knew, whom he cared for, whom he loved. Warmth rose from his chest, through his shoulders, through his arms, through his fingertips. It entered the metal. The blanks on the floor flashed blue, all 3, simultaneously. The hall shuddered. The metal sang. Dan heard nothing else. No voices from outside. No clanging of weapons. Not even his own breathing. Only the singing of the metal. The first blank. The flow regulator. A cylinder with an internal spiral. An unfinished cut. The first ones had stopped halfway. Dan ran his fingers along the spiral. It told him where to go, how deep, what step. He took a cutter from the rack. His hands moved on their own, not quickly, precisely. Each cut like a breath. The spiral grew beneath his fingers, turn by turn. He thought of Kira, of how she stands at the gate, about how her sword glistened in the morning light, about how she'd carried a useless guy on her back for 3 years and pretended she didn't care. The flow regulator lay in his palm, finished, warm, pulsing, alive. The second blank, the distributor, a flat disc with 100 holes, Each hole directed the flow of energy into its own channel, into its own corridor, into its own part of the dungeon. Half the holes had been drilled, half had not. Dan took the drill bit of the first ones, thin, made of an alloy he didn't know. Resonance told him the composition. He began drilling. He dedicated each hole to someone. This is for Sora, who sees everything and hides herself. This is for Yuna, who heals everyone and forgets about herself. This is for Ren, who doesn't believe you can just stay as you are. This is for Evelyn, who's tired of calculating everyone and wants to finally trust. This is for Bolt, who waited 1,000 years and finally got what he was waiting for. The distributor lit up, an even blue light from every hole, like a constellation in the palm of your hand. The third component, the most complex one, the resonant core, the part that's supposed to connect everything, the regulator, the distributor, the great mechanism, the constructs, walls, corridors, the entire dungeon. The component was simply a sphere, made of an alloy Dan had never touched, cold, heavy, silent. The resonance touched it and bounced off. The metal didn't speak, not because it didn't want to, because it was waiting. Waiting not just for a master, waiting for the one who would give. Dan understood. 3 components, 3 nodes. The regulator was responsible for control, the distributor for direction, and the core for the source. The source had to be the master himself, not his strength, not his magic, his care, his connection to those around him, his love disguised as work. Dan placed the sphere on the floor. He sat down in front of it. He placed both palms on top. There was a rumbling outside. 5 minutes passed. The mercenaries moved forward. He heard Kyra's scream, the clang of steel, the whistle of an arrow. Yuna was shouting something about the right flank. Ren was screaming. Bolt was darting around at his feet, flashing red. Dan didn't lift his head. He was giving it away. Everything. Every memory. Every repair. Every object he had ever held in his hands in both lives. The old woman's clock he hadn't had time to finish. The music box he'd spent 3 months restoring. The armchair with carved legs. The copper samovar. The porcelain doll. Every object entrusted to him. Every person who brought him their broken things and said, please. He gave up the memory of each of them, and the sphere accepted it. The metal grew warm. It hummed. It vibrated. A blue light flashed inside. Not dim, bright, blinding. Dan stood up. The sphere burned in his hands like a small sun. He stepped toward the great mechanism, inserted the flow regulator. Click. Inserted the distributor. Click. Raised the core. The final node. The final void. A place that had waited 1,000 years. There was a crash outside. Kira burst into the hall head first. She parried a blow. Another. Mercenaries were battering the gates. Sora fired arrow after arrow. Yuna was dragging Ren away. She had clung to the bow's shaft and refused to leave. Evelyn stood with a dagger in her hand. Guildmaster, politician, schemer, with a dagger, against 30. Dan inserted the core into the mechanism. A click. The world froze. A second of silence. Absolute. Not a sound, not a breath, not a breeze. Then the great mechanism came to life. The gears began to turn. For the first time in 1,000 years, slowly, heavily, with the grinding and groaning of metal that had forgotten how to move. But they moved. The shafts spun, the pipes hummed. Waves of blue light raced across the walls of the hall, across the ceiling, across the floor, across every stone, across every corridor, down, deeper, further. The wave traveled through the dungeon like a pulse through a body. The rust on the walls trembled. The brown growths cracked. They began to crumble, to fall away as dust. Beneath them, clean stone was revealed, clean metal, living lines of blue light. Constructs. Rows of the dead along the walls of the hall. Hundreds of bronze bodies that had stood motionless for 1,000 years. They stirred. The first. Green eyes. The second. The third. The 10th. The 20th. One by one they awoke, raised their heads, turned toward the mechanism, toward Dan. Green dots. Dozens of green dots in the dark hall. The mercenaries at the gate froze, even the most seasoned, even veterans of dozens of dungeons, because hundreds of awakened guards were staring at them, and the expression in those green eyes left no room for doubt. The hall had come alive, and the hall was defending its master. Kira lowered her sword. She stepped back. The mercenaries retreated. Garland Wayne stood at the entrance. His face was calm. He looked at the mechanism, at the constructs, at the blue light flooding the walls, and at Dan, who stood in the center of it all, unarmed, with hands covered in oil and metal dust, with eyes that glowed the same blue. Garland entered the hall, alone, without the mercenaries. He walked slowly. The constructs turned their heads, following him. He stopped 10 paces from Dan. He looked at the great mechanism. Dan saw his face. Not anger, no greed. Admiration. Genuine. Sincere. For a single second, Garland Wayne was neither a merchant nor a collector. He was a man who, for the first time, had seen something he could not buy. Garland Wayne stood and watched the mechanism in operation. The gears turned, the pipes hummed, the blue light pulsed evenly and calmly, like a heartbeat. He spoke. His voice was steady, without a hint of threat. He said he was impressed, truly. He said that over 30 years he had assembled the largest collection of First One's artifacts in Arkandale. 400 items. Not a single one worked. Not a single one. He had hired the best craftsmen, blacksmiths, mechanics, alchemists. He spent a fortune. The result was always the same. Dead metal. But a boy with no forge and no anvil had set the great mechanism in motion, with his bare hands. He asked how. Dan answered, simply, without fanfare. He said that the First One's artifacts don't work because they're being forced. They can't be forced. You can only ask. You can only understand why they were made, for whom, with what love, and give that back to them. Garland was silent. His face was working. Dan saw two worlds colliding inside this man's head. A world where things are commodities, resources, tools, and a world where things are someone's father's swords and mother's mortars and a child's foxes. Garland said those were beautiful words, but wars aren't fought with beautiful words. That rust is creeping into the cities, that constructs are going mad and killing people, that weapons are needed, power is needed. We need an army of artifacts. We need a man who can bring them to life. And that man stands before him and refuses to help. Dan shook his head. He said he wasn't refusing to help. He was refusing to churn them out. Garland asked what the difference was. Dan pointed to the walls of the hall, to the clean stone where there had been rust an hour ago, to the working mechanism, at the constructs with green eyes. He said, that's the difference. Slaying constructs is treating the symptom. Churning out artifact weapons is creating a new symptom. But he treats the cause. He repairs the dungeons, restores their function, restores circulation. And when the dungeon works properly, rust doesn't appear. Constructs don't go mad. Walls don't spew distorted energy. He doesn't make weapons. He makes sure weapons aren't needed. Garland looked at him, for a long time, intently. Dan didn't look away. He's no hero, not a warrior, not a brave man. But he stood before the most influential man in the region and spoke what he believed. Because behind him stood people worth believing in. Garland turned to his mercenaries. They were waiting at the gate, tense, under the gaze of hundreds of constructs. One gesture from Garland and they would attack. One gesture and the battle would begin. Constructs against mercenaries, steel against bronze. There would be casualties on both sides. Garland knew this. He had calculated it. Dan saw how his eyes darted around the hall, assessing, counting, how many constructs, what size, in what condition, what the odds were. Dan said quietly, that Garland could walk in and take him by force. He could. The constructs wouldn't stop 30 veterans, not all of them. Many would fall, but so would some of the mercenaries, and in the end, Garland would get a master who wouldn't work, because stamping kills the gift, because under coercion, resonance falls silent, because you can't force someone to love, and without love, his hands are just hands. Garland looked at him. Dan said one more thing. He said that if Garland wanted his artifacts to come to life, all 400 of them, he could bring them here, not as an order, not as a contract, as a request, to tell him about each one, where it came from, who found it, what happened to it, to give Dan time, to give Dan the story of every single thing, and then maybe, no guarantees, maybe, he'll be able to help. Silence in the hall. The gears turned, the construct stood, the mercenaries waited. Kira gripped the hilt of her sword. Sora held an arrow on the bowstring. Yuna stood motionless. Ren held her breath. Evelyn looked at Garland with an expression Dan couldn't read. Garland lowered his head. A second, 2, 3. He raised it. His face changed, not drastically, just a little. Something in his eyes, as if a crack had run through the wall he'd been building for 30 years. He said he'd think about it, turned around, left the hall, mounted his horse. His mercenaries retreated behind him. The caravan set off down the road back. Dust rose and settled. Silence. Kira sheathed her sword. Her hands were shaking.
She didn't show it, but Dan saw.
Sora climbed down from the rock. Her quiver was half empty. She hadn't shot at people. She'd shot at the ground in front of them. She'd been warning them. Yuna sat down on the floor right where she was standing. Her legs wouldn't hold her. Ren still wasn't breathing. Then she inhaled, deeply, with a sob. Bolt ran up to Dan and bumped his head against his knee. Dan sank to the floor, next to the great mechanism, which was working, which was humming, which was alive. He looked at his hands, dirty, scratched, trembling, the hands of a restorer, with which he hadn't killed a single person, had never raised a single sword, had never struck a single enemy, and with which he had just stopped an army. Evelyn walked over to him, sat down beside him, was silent for a minute. Then she said he was crazy, that asking Garland Vane to bring the artifacts as a favor was either genius or madness. Dan said it was one and the same. Evelyn laughed, quietly, for the first time in his presence. She took a small object out of the inner pocket of her cloak, a pocket watch, silver, with initials engraved on the lid. She placed it on the floor in front of him. She said it was her mentor's watch, the man who taught her everything, and whom she betrayed for the sake of her career in the guild. The watch hasn't worked since that day. She stopped it herself, pulled out the crown, as if she could stop time, stop the guilt. She's carried it with her for 15 years, as a reminder. Dan picked up the watch. Silver, cold, heavy. The resonance flowed. He felt it. The watch was intact. The mechanism was working. The spring was fine. The anchor was in place. The balance wheel was intact. Evelyn hadn't broken it. She'd just pulled out the crown and it had stopped. Fixing it took a second. Put the crown back in. Turn it twice. The watch ticked, and it started again. Dan held it out to Evelyn. She took it. She looked at the dial, at the ticking second hand. Her hands were shaking. Guildmaster, politician, a woman who saw right through people and calculated everyone's next 10 moves. She sat on the floor of the ancient hall with the ticking watch in her hands and couldn't say a word. Dan quietly said that the watch had never been broken, that she could wind it at any moment. She'd been able to for 15 years. That the fault wasn't in the clock, and forgiveness wasn't in the clock. That the clock had simply been waiting for her to be ready to let go. Evelyn closed the lid, pressed the clock to her chest, closed her eyes. She opened them. She looked at Dan. Her gaze had changed, as if she had finally seen what she had staked everything on 3 years ago. Not a gift, not an ability, not a tool, a person. A month after Garland's departure, the hall was functioning. The great mechanism hummed steadily. The rust was receding, slowly but surely. Every day Dan went down into the corridors and cleaned the pipes. Every day the lines on the walls glowed a little brighter. Every day the constructs woke up. One by one, 2 at a time, sometimes 5. Bolt commanded them. A small, stocky construct with green eyes walked between the rows and assigned tasks. This one cleans. This one carries. This one stands guard. He was the first, and the rest listened to him, like they listened to an older brother. Mira woke up in the third week. Dan was working in the lower corridor when Bolt came running and blinked his eyes so fast it looked like a strobe light. Dan ran upstairs. In the center of the hall, next to the great mechanism, stood a girl, or what looked like a girl. Short, slender, pale skin with a slight blue tinge, hair like polished copper. Her eyes were large and bright, like two emeralds. She stood barefoot on the stone floor, looking at her hands, turning them, bending her fingers, as if she were seeing them for the first time. Mira, guardian of the hall, spirit guardian of the first one's mechanisms. She had existed for 1,000 years in a dormant state, bound to the great mechanism. When the mechanism died, she fell asleep. When the mechanism came to life, she awoke. She looked at Dan, tilted her head to the side, just like Bolt, the exact same gesture, because she was part of the same idea. She spoke her first words in 1,000 years. She asked, "Master, is that you?" Dan didn't know what to say. He said his name was Dan. Mira repeated it, Dan. Then she said she had waited a long time, that it had been dark, that it had been quiet, that she had forgotten almost everything, the names of the first ones, her purpose, her history, as if rust had eaten away at her memory bit by bit while she slept. She remembered only one thing, that someone would come, that someone would touch the mechanism, that someone would wake her, and here she was. Kira stood by the wall and looked at Mira with an expression that was hard to read. Wariness, curiosity, jealousy. Sora quietly asked Yuna if she was human. Yuna said she didn't know. Ren walked up to Mira and looked up at her. Mira looked at Ren. She reached out and touched her hair. Ren flinched. Mira said it was soft. Ren said she was crazy. Mira tilted her head. She asked what crazy meant. Dan realized this was going to be difficult. Mira didn't understand human conventions. She was a mechanism, a complex one, a rational one, but a mechanism. She didn't know you weren't supposed to touch other people's hair. Didn't know you weren't supposed to stand too close. She didn't know that people eat and sleep and get tired. In the first week, she asked Dan 400 questions. He counted. Why do people blink? Why does food smell? What are clothes for? Why does Kira blush when Dan fixes something next to her? She asked that question out loud in front of Kira. Kira blushed even more and left. But Mira wasn't just curious. She was damaged. Her memory was like a sieve, huge holes. She remembered that she was a keeper, but she didn't remember what that meant. She remembered that the first ones were in the hall, but she didn't remember their faces. She remembered she had a mission, but she didn't remember what it was. Rust had been eating away at her for 1,000 years, while she slept, bit by bit. Dan realized he had to fix her, too. Not as a mechanism, as a person. To give her back what the rust had taken. Memory, personality, meaning. He started small. Every evening after work, he would sit next to her and talk. Not about himself, about the hall, about what he felt through resonance, about the first ones, about what they were like, what they built, why. Mira listened. Her eyes burned, literally. The green light grew brighter when she remembered, and with each evening she remembered a little more, a piece, a shard, a name that suddenly surfaced from the void. She said it once, Elior. Dan asked who that was. Mira didn't know, but the name was important. She could feel it. Dan felt it too, through the resonance. Elior. That name echoed in every cog of the great mechanism, in every stone of the walls, in every line on the ceiling. Elior was the one who created Mira, the one who began building the great mechanism, the one who didn't live to finish it, the one whose face Dan saw in the rust, the first among the first. Mira wept when she remembered, not with tears, with blue light from her eyes, thin rays like threads. She said that Elior didn't want to leave, that the first ones didn't want to fade away. But the world stopped understanding them. Generation after generation, people forgot why the dungeons were built. They forgot that constructs are not enemies but helpers. They forgot that mechanisms are not traps but tools. And when the last person who understood stopped coming, the first began to lose themselves. Rust is not a disease. Rust is oblivion made flesh. The first ones became rust, because the world forgot them. And when you are forgotten, you cease to exist as yourself. You become noise, interference, a glitch, rust. Dan listened, and he understood. He understood better than anyone, because he repaired things that had been forgotten, because he restored their meaning, because he himself had been forgotten, in both lives. A quiet restorer in the museum basement whom no one noticed, a useless rookie in the unit whom they dragged along out of pity, forgotten, invisible, and only here, only in this hall, only with these people, he was finally seen. Mira approached him. She placed her palm on his hand. Her fingers were cool, metallic, but alive. She said he wasn't alone, that Elior had been like that too, quiet, invisible, with scratched fingers, that the door wasn't looking for a hero, it was looking for an heir, the one whose soul had already been a restorer before he was born into this world. Dan wasn't surprised. Somewhere deep down, he had known this from the very beginning, from the moment his fingers found the curved rivet on the door. He hadn't ended up here by accident. He had been called. Through 1,000 years of oblivion, through death by fire, through 3 years of emptiness. He was called because things remember, even when people forget. A year had passed. The Hall of Heritage had become different. The blue lines burned bright and steady. The corridors were clean. The constructs were working. 200 guards were on duty on every level. Bolt commanded them with the gravitas of a general and the stature of a stool. The workshop had expanded. 1 workbench had turned into 5, shelves with tools, shelves with blanks, a drafting table, a separate corner for Wren, who practiced wood carving every evening and had already carved 6 figures, crooked, rough, but hers. She didn't ask if she could stay. She simply lived. For the first time in her life, she simply lived. Every morning she came to the workshop. Every evening she went to her room on the 2nd floor, the room Dan had set up for her. She didn't thank him. She couldn't. The words wouldn't come. But one day Dan found a small figurine on his workbench. Clumsy, crooked, a man with a file in his hands. It was him. Wren watched from her corner and pretended not to be looking. Dan placed the figurine on the shelf, next to the tools. Wren smiled, for the first time in front of him, quickly, like a flash, and hid her face. Kira led the defense. After Garland left, she spent 2 months training with the constructs, teaching them to form ranks, to move in groups, to cover each other. She wasn't a strategist by training. She was a swordswoman. But 3 years at the head of a squad had taught her to think like a commander. And her father's repaired sword had taught her to fight in a way she'd never fought before. The blade's balance had changed after the repair. It had become an extension of her arm, not her father's, hers, and she moved with it as if it were a part of her own body. Sora became the eyes of the hall. She found the first one's observation post on the upper levels, a network of mirrors and lenses that allowed them to see every approach to the dungeon from a distance of kilometers. Dan repaired the system in a week. Now Sora sat in her nest and saw everything, every traveler, every caravan, every group of adventurers. She wore the repaired compass around her neck. The needle pointed toward Zal, toward home, always. Yuna opened an infirmary on the 1st level, a clean room with stone couches and herbs on the walls. She didn't just treat her own people. Adventurers from other groups began coming to her, with wounds, with poisonings, with rust. Yuna didn't turn anyone away, and Dan repaired their gear while they were being treated, for free, for everyone. Word spread, not about the fearsome master with an impossible gift, about a place where they'd fix you, you and your things. The workshop became a home, not a fortress, not a base, a home, a place to return to, a place where they wait. Evelyn came every week, officially on guild business, unofficially because the ticking watch on a chain was the warmest thing in her pocket. She never spoke of it, but Dan saw how she would sometimes pause mid-conversation and touch her pocket. where the watch of the mentor she had betrayed, and whom she had finally begun to forgive, ticked. Mira had changed over the past year. Dan pieced her memory back together bit by bit, every evening, sometimes with a touch, sometimes with words, sometimes with resonance through the walls of the hall. She remembered a lot, not everything, but enough. She remembered that her task was to preserve the knowledge of the first ones. She remembered how the mechanisms worked. She remembered the languages and symbols on the walls. And she remembered Elior, not completely, in fragments, his voice, his hands, his habit of talking to metal, like Dan. She said that Elior smiled the same way, when he listened to the gears, when a thing came to life under his fingers. She said this, and her eyes burned brighter, and dimmed, because Elior was in the rust, dissolved, waiting, calling. Garland Wayne kept his word. 3 months after the retreat, he sent the first artifact. No contract, no conditions, with a note. The note contained a single sentence. Tell me what he wanted to say. Dan took the artifact, a bronze cylinder with gears inside. The resonance told him. It was a voice transmitter. The first ones used these to talk to each other through the walls of the dungeons. This particular one was made by a master for his daughter, who worked in another wing, so he could hear her voice. Dan fixed it, and passed the note to Garland. In it, he wrote that the father had made it to hear his daughter's voice. Garland sent a second artifact, a third, a fourth. By the end of the year, Dan had repaired 32, each with a story, each for someone specific, and every time he wrote to Garland. For whom? Why? What the master felt when he made this thing. Garland didn't come in person, but his notes changed. The first was businesslike. The 10th was brief. The 20th contained the word please. The 32nd contained the word thank you. The crack was growing. Dan wasn't just healing dungeons. He was healing the world. One thing at a time, one person at a time, one story at a time. Slowly, quietly, without swords and without armies. A year had passed, and Dan stood at a crossroads. Mira had remembered enough to show him the way down, to the lowest level of the dungeon, to where the rust was thickest, to where the first ones had dissolved completely, to where Elior was waiting. Dan could go down and try to bring them back, restore them, pull them out of the rust. Mira said that the great mechanism had been built for this very purpose, that the 3 nodes he had inserted were the key, that if he went down and released the resonance into the very heart of the rust, into the place where the first ones had gone, he would be able to bring them back, or let them go, forever. To bring them back meant taking a risk. The first ones were people of another era. The world had changed over 1,000 years. They might not accept him, might not understand. A clash of 2 eras, 2 value systems, 2 worlds in one. But their knowledge would save Arkandale. Their mastery would stop the rust forever. Letting them go meant giving them peace, ending a 1,000-year wait, letting them leave. But then Dan would be left alone, the only master, the only one who understands, for the whole world, for all the dungeons, for all the rust. An impossible burden for one man. He stood before the great mechanism. Everyone was around him. Kira, Sora, Yuna, Mira, Evelyn, Ren. Bolt at his feet. 200 constructs along the walls. A hall full of life that a year ago had been dead. Dan placed his palms on the mechanism, closed his eyes, and asked not himself, asked the metal, asked the stone, asked the gears and shafts and pipes and lines on the walls, asked Elior, not with words, resonance. What do you want? The answer came, not in words, in an image, a workshop, bright, warm, full of people, young craftsmen at their workbenches, old constructs nearby, the first one's tools in living hands, knowledge passed down not through books but through touch, through work, through care. Elior didn't want to return. He wanted someone to carry on, not to repeat, to carry on, in their own way. Dan opened his eyes. He looked at his people. Each one was looking at him, waiting. He said he would go down, but not to bring back the first ones, and not to let them go, to thank them, and say goodbye, and take their knowledge, not as a trophy, as a legacy, to pass on, to teach others, so that in 10 years, or 20, or 100, not a single master would stand before the rust, but 1,000, 10,000, a whole world of people who know how to listen to things. He went down, alone. They wanted to go with him, all of them. Kira wanted to fight the rust. Sora wanted to light the way. Yuna wanted to heal if something went wrong. Ren wanted to be useful. Mira wanted to see Elior. Dan said no. This was between him and the first ones, between the heir and those who left the legacy, between the master and those who created the workshop. He walked down, level by level. The rust grew thicker. The growths on the walls pulsed. He forgot the words. He remembered. He forgot again. The resonance burned in his palms like a torch. He reached the bottom, the last level. A room, round, small. The walls were completely covered in rust, the floor, the ceiling, every inch. And in the center of the room, a figure, human, made of rust, sitting on the floor, hands on his knees, head bowed, like a master who had fallen asleep at work. Elior. Dan approached, sat down opposite him, placed his palms on the rusty hands. Resonance entered the rust, and Dan saw everything. 1,000 years. The history of the first ones from beginning to end. How they built. How they created. How they loved their creations. How the world changed around them. How people stopped understanding, stopped coming, stopped asking why. How the first ones tried to get through. How they built dungeons more complex and deeper, hoping that someone would peek in and ask what it was. How they stopped hoping. How they began to fade away, one by one, within their creations, in stone and metal. Because if no one sees you, if no one understands your work, you cease to be yourself, and you become noise. Dan was crying. Tears streamed down his cheeks and fell onto Elior's rusty hands. Where they fell, the rust cracked. Not from the tears, from the resonance, from understanding, from the fact that for the first time in 1,000 years, someone was sitting across from him and seeing. Elior raised his head, his face, made of rust, blurred, but alive. Eyes, warm, tired, grateful. He didn't speak. He couldn't. 1,000 years of rust had taken his voice, but Dan felt it, through his hands, through the metal, through the stone. Thank you. You came. Dan squeezed his hands, said he had come, that he saw, that he understood, that he would not forget, that he would teach others, that the world would listen to things again, that workshops would be full of people with scratched fingers, that constructs would not be lonely, that the dungeons wouldn't be abandoned, that no one would fade into oblivion anymore, because he, Dan. So, a restorer from another world, a boy with a file, would repair, as long as his hands held out, as long as his heart held out, until the last gear fell into place. Elior smiled. The rust on his face cracked. Beneath it was light, blue, warm, alive. He crumbled, not into dust, into light, soft and warm. Light filled the room. It passed through the walls, through the ceiling, through the floor, upward, through every level of the dungeon, through every corridor, through the great mechanism, through the hall, and further, outward, into the sky, into the world. Dan sat on the floor of the clean room. The rust had vanished. The walls were bare, stone. Lines were visible on them, not blue, golden, warm, like a sunset, like the light in the workshop at night, like his father's hand on his shoulder. The knowledge of the first ones, all 1,000 years, every technique, every material, every mechanism, every gear, recorded in these walls, for him, for those who would come after. Legacy. Dan stood up, wiped his face, went upstairs, level by level, The corridors were clean. The walls shone. Constructs stood along the passageways and bowed as he walked past. Green eyes, hundreds of green eyes in the clean, bright corridors. He stepped into the hall. They were there. All of them. Kira was first. She stood closest to the exit from the lower levels. How long she had waited. It was clear from her face that she had waited all night. She saw him. His face, red eyes, wet cheeks, dirty hands, and she understood. She didn't ask what had happened. She just stepped forward and hugged him, tightly, silently. The sword at his belt pressed against his thigh. She didn't notice. He didn't notice. Sora was next. She put her hand on his shoulder, didn't say a word, but her eyes were shining. Yuna hugged him from the side, pressed her cheek against his shoulder, told him he was an idiot, that he shouldn't go out alone, that she'd nearly gone gray, and that the soup had gone cold. Ren ran into him at full speed, a little bundle, clinging to his jacket, her face pressed against his stomach. She didn't say anything. She couldn't. Mira stood a step away. Her eyes burned with gold, not green, gold, like the walls below. She could feel it. Elior was gone, for real, forever, and left everything he had, to her, to Dan, to Mira. She said quietly, "Thank you for saying goodbye for me." Evelyn stood a little way off. She pressed the ticking watch to her chest. She was smiling, with just her lips, like back then, on the tavern stairs, when she saw the bet had paid off. Bolt came running up last, small, stocky, with green eyes. He held out his palm. A wrench lay on it. Dan took it. He looked at the hall, at the great mechanism that was working, at the constructs that lived, at the walls that shone, at the people standing nearby, not out of pity, not out of self-interest, not out of duty, because they wanted to, because this was home. He said they had a lot of work, that there were 1,000 years of knowledge down there, that they needed to learn, they needed to teach, they needed to repair other dungeons, other cities, other lives. That one master was a start, but the world deserved 1,000 masters. Kira said he was at it again. Sora nodded. Yuna said he should eat first. Ren said she'd be the first at the workbench. Mira said she'd show them the first one's library. Evelyn said she'd secure funding. Bolt handed over the second key, for Ren. Dan looked at them, at all of them, at each one, and he realized what he had carried out of the fire. Not someone else's relics, not the old woman's watch, not a box of family stories. He had carried himself out, his own hands, his own care, his ability to see the living and the broken. And he had found those for whom all of this was not a tool, but a home. He didn't save the world like a hero. He fixed it, along the line of someone's grasp, along the silvery crack in the stone mortar, along the warm paw of a wooden fox, along the ticking clock that was never broken, along the compass needle that pointed home. The master returned to his work.